Welcome back to your next chapter in the History of Protestantism by James A. Wiley. I'm Nicholas Arthur, and you are listening to Prophecy Reformation Now. Because God-given prophecy is history in advance, it is very important for the Christian to learn about the history of the church that Jesus said he would build, starting about 2,000 years ago when he said, "I will build my church." Only if we truly understand history can we find our place in the prophecy of the Revelation, and perhaps even come to know what must shortly come to pass in our own time as well. So, let us pick up right where we left off last time. 3 days passed. It was now the 18th of November, and on this day Poeli, the bricklayer, was to die. His stake was set up in the suburb of St. Antoine, in front of the church of St. Catherine, for it was the inhabitants of this quarter of Paris who were next to be taught to what a dreadful end heresy brings men, and yet with what a glorious hope and unconquerable courage it has the power to inspire them. Poeli had learned the gospel from Bishop Briconet, but while the master had scandalized it by weakness, the disciple was to glorify it by his steadfastness. He wore an air of triumph as he alighted from his cart at the place of execution. Cruel, very cruel, was his treatment at the stake. "My Lord Jesus Christ," he said, "reigns in heaven, and I am ready to fight for him to the last drop of my blood." This confession of truth at the moment of punishment, says de Bigny, quoting Crespin's description of the martyr's last moments, exasperated the executioners. "Wait a bit," they said, "we will stop your prating." They sprang upon him, opened his mouth, caught hold of his tongue, and bored a hole through it. They then, with refined cruelty, made a slit in his cheek, through which they drew the tongue, and fastened it with an iron pin. Some cries were heard from the crowd at this most terrible spectacle. They proceeded from the humble Christians who had come to help the poor bricklayer with their compassionate looks. Poeli spoke no more, but his eyes still announced the peace he enjoyed. He was burnt alive. For some time each succeeding day had its victim. Of these sufferers there were some whose only crime was that they had printed and sold Luther's writings. It was not clear that they had embraced his sentiments. Their persecutors deemed them well deserving of the stake for simply having a hand in circulating them. This indiscriminate vengeance, which dragged to a common pile the Protestants and all on whom the mere suspicion of Protestantism had fallen, spread a general terror in Paris. Those who had been at the Protestant sermons, those who had indulged in a jest at the expense of the monks, but especially those who, in heart, although not confessing it with the mouth, had abandoned Rome and turned to the gospel, felt as if the eye of the lieutenant criminal was upon them, and that at any moment his step might be heard on their threshold. Paris was no longer a place for them. Every day and every hour they tarried there. It was at the peril of being burned alive. Accordingly, they rose up and fled. It was bitter to leave home and country and all the delights of life and go forth into exile, but it was less bitter than to surrender their hope of an endless life in the better country, for at no less a cost could they escape a stake in France. A few days made numerous blanks in the society of Paris. Each blank represented a convert to the gospel. When men began to look around them and count these gaps, they were amazed to think how many of those among whom they had been living and with whom they had come in daily contact were Lutherans, but wholly unknown in that character till this affair brought them to light. Merchants vanished suddenly from their place of business. Tradesmen disappeared from their workshops. Clerks were missing from the counting houses. Students assembled at the usual hour, but the professor's chair was empty. Their teacher, not wanting to bid his pupils adieu, had gone forth and was hastening towards some more friendly land. The bands of fugitives now hurrying by various routes and in various disguises to the frontiers of the kingdom embraced all ranks and all occupations. The lords of Roignac and Roberval, of Fleury, in Briery, were among those who were now fleeing their country and the wrath of their sovereign. Men in government offices, and others high at court and near the person of the king, made their first disclosure by a hasty flight that they had embraced the gospel, and they preferred it to place and emolument. Among these last was the privy purse-bearer of the king. Every hour brought a new surprise to both the friends and the foes of the gospel. The latter hated it yet more than ever as a mysterious thing, possessing some extraordinary power over the minds of men. They saw with it a sort of terror the numbers it had already captivated, and they had uneasy misgivings as to where this affair would grow. Margaret wept, but her fear in which she stood of her brother made her conceal her tears. Her 3 preachers, Russell, Berthard, and Carrault, had been thrown into the prison. Should she make a supplication for them? Her enemies, she knew, were laboring to inflame the king against her and bring her to the block. The constable Montmorency says, Brantome told the king that he must begin at his court and his nearest relations, pointing at the Queen of Navarre, if he had a mind to extirpate the heretics out of his kingdom. Any indiscretion or overzeal, therefore, might prove fatal to her. Nevertheless, she resolved on braving the king's wrath, if happily she might rescue her friends from the stake. Bigotry had not quenched Francis's love for his sister. The lives of her preachers were given her at her request, but with the exception of one of the 3. Their services to the Protestant cause ended with the day on which they were let out of prison. Russell retired to his abbey at Clairec. Berthaud resumed his frock and his beads and died in the cloister. Carrault contrived to make his escape, and turning his steps toward Switzerland, he reached Basel, became minister at Orbe, and finally was a fellow laborer with Calvin at Geneva. Meanwhile another and yet another rose up and fled, till the band of self-confessed and self-expatriated disciples of the gospel swelled to between 400 and 500, goldsmiths, engravers, notably printers and bookbinders, men of all crafts, lawyers, teachers of youth, and even monks and priests were crowding the roads and byways of France, fleeing from the persecutor. Some went to Strasbourg, some to Basel, and a few placed the Alps between them and their native land. Among these fugitives, there's one who deserves special mention, Mathurin Cordier, the venerable schoolmaster who was the first to detect, and who so largely helped to develop the wonderful genius of Calvin. Millen and Dubourg and Poëli we have seen also depart, but their flight was by another road than that which these fugitives were now treading in weariness and hunger and fear. They had gone where the persecutor could not follow them. The men who were now fleeing from France were the first to tread that path which was to be trodden again and again by hundreds of thousands of their countrymen in years to come. During the following 2 centuries and a half, these scenes were renewed at short intervals. Scarcely was there a generation of Frenchmen during that long period that did not witness the disciples of the gospel fleeing before the insane fury of the persecutor, and carrying with them the intelligence, the arts, the industry, the order, in which, as a rule, they preeminently excelled, to enrich the lands in which they found an asylum. And in proportion as they replenished other countries with these good gifts, did they empty their own of them. if all that was now driven away had been retained in France, if during these 300 years the industrial skill of the exiles had been cultivating her soil, if, during those 300 years, their artistic bent had been improving her manufactures, if during these 300 years their creative genius and analytic power had been enriching her literature and cultivating her science, if their wisdom had been guiding her counsels, their bravery fighting her battles, their equity framing her laws, and the religious of the Bible strengthening the intellect and governing the conscience of her people, what a glory would at this day have filled all of France! What a great, prosperous, and happy country! A pattern to the nations she would have been. But a blind and inexorable bigotry chased from her soil every teacher of virtue, every champion of order, every honest defender of the throne. It is said to the men who would have made their country a renown and glory in the earth, choose which you will have, a stake or exile. At last the ruin of the state was complete. There remained no more conscience to be proscribed, no more religion to be dragged to the stake, no more patriotism to be chased into banishment. Revolution now entered the morally devastated land, bringing in its train scaffolds and massacres, and once more crowding the roads and flooding the frontiers of France with herds of miserable exiles. Only this time there was an exchange of victims. Chapter 21. Other and more dreadful martyrdoms. A great purgation resolved on. Preparations. Procession. The four mendicants. Relics. The head of St. Louis, the true cross, etc. Living dignitaries. The host. The king on foot. His penitence. Of what sins does he repent? The queen. Ambassadors, nobles, etc. Homage to the citizens. High Mass in Notre Dame. Speech of the king. The oath of the king. Return of procession. Apparatus of torture. Martyrdom of Nicholas Valaton. More scaffolds and victims. The king and people's satisfaction. An ominous day in the calendar of France. The 21st of January. As yet we have seen only the beginning of the tragedy. Its more awful scenes are to follow. Numerous stakes had already been planted in Paris, but these did not abate the vengeance of the persecutor. More victims must be immolated, if expiation was to be done for the affront offered to heaven in the matter of the placards. The more bloodshed, if the land was to be cleansed from the frightful pollution it had undergone. Such was the talk which the priests held in presence of the king. They reminded him that this was a crisis in France, that he was the eldest son of the Church, that this title it became him to preserve unsullied, and transmit with honor to his posterity, and they urged him to proceed with all due rigor in the performance of those bloody rites by which his throne and kingdom were to be purged. Francis I was but too willing to obey. A grand procession, which was to be graced by bloody interludes, was arranged, and the day on which it was to be scheduled was the 21st of January, 1535. The horrors which will make this day famous to all time were not the doings of the king alone. They were not less the acts of the nation by which its constituted representatives countenanced the ceremonial and put its hand to its cruel and sanguinary work. The day fixed on arrived. The crowds from the country began to pour into Paris. In the city, great preparations had been made for the spectacle. The houses along the line of the march were hung with mourning drapery. and altars rose at intervals where the host might repose as it was being borne along to its final resting place on the high altar of Notre Dame. A throng of sightseers filled the streets. Not only was every inch of the pavement occupied by human beings, but every doorstep had its little group, every window its cluster of faces. Even the roofs were black with onlookers, perched on the beams or hanging by the chimneys. There was not, says Simon Fontaine, a chronicler of that day, and a doctor of the Sorbonne, the smallest piece of wood or stone jutting out of the walls on which a spectator was not perched, provided there was but room enough, and one might have fancied the streets were paved with human heads. Though it was day, a lighted taper was struck in front of every house to do reverence to the Blessed Sacrament and the holy relics. At the early hour of 6, the procession marshaled at the Louvre. First came the banners and crosses of the several parishes. Next appeared the citizens, walking two and two, and bearing torches in their hands. The 4 mendicant orders followed, the Dominican in his white woolen gown and black cloak, the Franciscan in his gown of coarse brown cloth, half-shod feet, and truncated cowl covering his shorn head, the Capuchin in his funnel-shaped cowl and patched brown cloak, girded with a white 3-knotted rope, and the Augustine with a little round hat on his shaven head, and wide black gown girded on his loins with a broad sash. After the monks walked the priests and canons of the city. The next part of the procession evoked, in no ordinary degree, the interest and the awe of the spectators. On no former occasion had so many relics been paraded on the streets of Paris. In the van of the procession was carried the head of St. Louis, the patron saint of France. There followed a bit of the true cross, the real crown of thorns, one of the nails, the swaddling clothes in which Christ lay, the purple robe in which he was attired, the towel with which he girded himself at the Last Supper, and the spear-head that pierced his side. Many saints of former times had sent each a bit of himself to grace the procession, and nourish the devotion of the onlookers. Some an arm, some a tooth, some a finger, and others one of many heads which, as it would seem, each had worn in his lifetime. This goodly array of saintly relics was closed by the shrine of Genevieve, the patron saint of Paris, borne by the corporation of butchers, who had prepared themselves for this holy work by the purification of a 3 days' fast. After the dead members of the church, whose relics were enshrined in silver and gold, came a crowd of living dignitaries in their robes and the insignia of their ecclesiastical rank. Cardinal and abbot, archbishop and bishop were there, in the glory of scarlet hat and purple gown, of cope and mitre and crozier. Now came the heart of this grand show, the host. And in it the spectator saw one mightier than any dead saint or living dignitary in all that great procession. The host was carried by the Bishop of Paris under a magnificent canopy, the 4 pillars of which were supported by 4 princes of the blood, the 3 sons of the king, and the Duke of Vendôme. After the host walked the king. The severe plainness of his dress was in marked and studied contrast to the magnificence of the robes in which the ecclesiastics that preceded the civic functionaries that followed him were arrayed. Francis I on that day wore no crown, nor robe of state, nor was he borne along in chariot or litter. He appeared walking on foot, his head uncovered, his eyes cast on the ground, and in his hand a lighted taper. The king was there in the character of a penitent. He was the chief mourner in that great national act of humiliation and repentance. He mourned with head bowed and eyes cast down, but with heart unbroken. For what did Francis I, monarch of France, do penance? For the debaucheries that defiled his palace? For the righteous blood that stained the streets of his capital? for the violated oaths by which he had attempted to overreach those who trusted him at home and those who were transacting with him abroad. No, these were venial offenses. They were not worth a thought on the part of the monarch. The King of France did penance for all the inexpiable crime of his Protestant subjects in daring to attack the Mass, and publish in the face of all France their protest against its blasphemy and idolatry. The end of the procession was not yet. It still swept on, at a slow pace, and in mournful silence, save when some penitential chant rose upon the air. Behind the king walked the queen. She was followed by all the members of the court, by the ambassadors of foreign sovereigns, by the nobles of the realm, by the members of Parliament in their scarlet robes, by judges, officers, and the guide of the various trades, each with a symbol of penitence in his hand, a lighted candle. The military guard could with difficulty keep open the way for the procession through the dense crowd, which pressed forward to touch some holy relic or kiss some image of saint. They lined the whole route taken by the processionists, and did homage on bended knee to the host as it passed them. The long procession rolled in at the gates of Notre Dame. The host, which had been carried there with so much solemnity, was placed on the high altar, and a solemn mass proceeded in the presence of perhaps a more brilliant assemblage than had ever before been gathered into even the great national temple of France. When the ceremony was concluded, the king returned to the bishop's palace, where he dined. After dinner, he adjourned with the whole assembly to the great hall, where he ascended a throne which had been fitted up for the occasion. It was understood that the king was to pronounce an oration, and the assembly kept silence, eager to hear what so august a speaker, on so great an occasion, would say. The king presented himself to his subjects with a sorrowful countenance, nor is it necessary to suppose that that sorrow was feigned. The affair of the placards threatened to embroil him with both friend and foe. It had crossed his political projects, and we can believe, moreover, that it had shocked his feelings and beliefs as a Roman Catholic, for there is little ground to think that Francis had begun to love the gospel, and the looks of sadness in which he showed himself to his subjects were not wholly counterfeited. The speech which Francis I delivered on this occasion, and several reports of it have come down to us, was touching and eloquent. He dwelt on the many favors Providence had conferred on France. Her enemies had felt the weight of her sword. Her friends had good cause to rejoice in her alliance. Even when punished for her faults, great mercy had been mingled with the chastisement. Above all, what an honor that France should have been enabled to preserve these long centuries in the path of the holy Catholic faith, and had so nobly worn her glorious title, Most Christian. But now, continued the king, she that has been preserved hitherto from straying so little seems on the point of a fatal plunge into heresy. Her soil has begun to produce monsters. God has been attacked in the Holy Sacrament. France has been dishonored in the eyes of other nations, and the cloud of the divine displeasure is darkening over her. Oh, the crime of blasphemy, the day of sorrow and disgrace! Oh, that it had never dawned upon us! These moving words drew tears from nearly all present, says the chronicler who reports the scene, and who was probably an eyewitness of it. Sobs and sighs burst from the assembly. After a pause, the king resumed. What a disgrace it will be if we do not extirpate these wicked creatures! If you know any person infected by this perverse sect, be he your parent, brother, cousin, or connection, give information against him. By concealing his misdeeds, you will be partakers of that pestilent faction. The assembly, says the chronicler, gave numerous signs of assent. I give thanks to God, he resumed, that the greatest, the most learned, and undoubtedly the majority of my subjects, and especially in this good city of Paris, are full of zeal for the Catholic religion. Then, says the chronicler, you might have seen the faces of the spectators change in appearance, and give signs of joy. Acclamations prevented the sighs, and sighs choked the acclamations. I warn you, continued the king, that I will have the said errors expelled and driven from my kingdom, and will excuse no one. Then he exclaimed, says our historian with extreme anger, as true, messieurs, as I am your king, if I knew one of my own limbs spotted or infected with this detestable rottenness, I would give it you to cut off. And farther, if I saw one of my children defiled by it, I would not spare him. I would deliver him up myself, and would sacrifice him to God. The king was so agitated that he was unable to proceed. He burst into tears. The assembly wept with him. The bishop of Paris and the provost of the merchants now approached the monarch, and kneeling before him swore, the first in the name of the clergy, the second in that of the citizens, to make war against heresy. Thereupon all the spectators exclaimed, with voices broken by sobbing, "We will live and die for the Catholic religion." Having sworn this oath in Notre Dame, the roof under which, nearly 3 centuries after, the goddess of reason sat enthroned, the assembly reformed and set forth to begin that war that very hour. Their zeal for the faith was inflamed to the utmost, but they were all the better prepared to witness the dreadful sights that awaited them. A terrible program had been sketched out. Horrors were to mark every step of the way back to the Louvre, but Francis and his courtiers were to gaze with pitiless eye and heart on these horrors. The procession, in returning, made a circuit by the church of the Genevieve, where now stands the Pantheon. At short distances, scaffolds had been erected on which certain Protestant Christians were to be burned alive, and it was arranged that the faggots should be lighted at the moment the king approached, and that the procession should halt to witness the execution. The men set apart to death were first to undergo prolonged and excruciating tortures, and for this end a most ingenious but cruel apparatus had been devised, which let us describe. First rose an upright beam, firmly planted in the ground. To that another beam was attached crosswise, and worked by a pulley and string. The martyr was fastened to one end of the movable beam by his hands, which were tied behind his back, and then he was raised in the air. He was next let down into the slow fire underneath. After a minute or two's boiling, he was raised again, and a second time let drop into the fire. And thus he was raised and lowered till the ropes that fastened him to the pole were consumed, and he fell amid the burning coals, where he lay till he gave up the ghost. The custom in France, says Sladen, describing these cruel tragedies, is to put malefactors to death in the afternoon, where first silence is cried, and then the crimes for which they suffer are repeated aloud. But when anyone is executed for Lutheranism, as they call it, that is, if any person hath disputed for justification by faith, not by works, that the saints are not to be invocated, that Christ is the only priest and intercessor for mankind, or if a man has happened to eat flesh on forbidden days, not a syllable of all this is published. But in general they cry that he hath renounced God Almighty and violated the decrees of our common mother, Holy Church. This aggravating way makes the vulgar believe such persons the most profligate wretches under the cope of heaven, insomuch that when they are broiling in the flames, it is usual for the people to storm at them, cursing them in the height of their torments, as if they were not worthy to tread upon the earth. The first to be brought forth was Nicholas Valaton, the Christian whom we have already mentioned as frequently to be seen searching the innermost recesses and nooks of the bookseller shops in quest of the writings of the Reformers. The priest offered him a pardon, provided he would recant. "My faith," he replied, "has a confidence in God, which will resist all the powers of hell." He was dealt with as we have already described, tied to the beam. He was alternately raised in the air and lowered into the flames, till the cords giving way, there came an end to his agonies. Other 2 martyrs were brought forward, and 3 times was this cruel sport enacted, the king and all the members of the procession standing by the while, and feasting their eyes on the torments of the sufferers. The King of France, like the Roman tyrant, wished that his victims should feel themselves die. This was on the road between the church of the Genevieve and the Louvre. The scene of this tragedy, therefore, could not be very far from the spot where, somewhat more than 250 years after, the scaffold was set up for Louis XVI and 2,800 other victims of the Revolution. The spectacles of the day were not yet closed. On the line of the march, the lieutenant criminal had prepared other scaffolds where the cruel apparatus of death stood waiting its prey, and before the procession reached the Louvre, there were more halts, more victims, more expiations, and when Francis I re-entered his palace and reviewed his day's work, he was well pleased to think that he had made propitiation for the affront offered to God in the sacrament, and that the cloud of vengeance, which had lowered above his throne, and his kingdom was rolled away. The priest declared that the triumph of the Church in France was now forever secured, and if any there were among the spectators whom these cruel deaths had touched with pity, by neither word nor sign dared they avow it. The populace of the capital were overjoyed. They had tasted of blood, and were not soon to forego their relish for it, nor to care much afterwards at whose expense they gratified it. As there are events so like to one another in their outward guise that they seem to be the same repeated, so there are days that appear to return over again, inasmuch as they come laden with the same good or evil fortune to which they had been consecrated. Every nation has such days. The 21st of January is a noted and ominous day in the calendar of France. Twice has that day summoned up spectacles of horror. Twice has it seen deeds enacted which have made France and the world shudder. And twice has it inaugurated an era of woes and tragedies which stand without parallel in history. The first 21st of January is that whose tragic scenes we have just described, and which opened an era that ran on until the close of the 18th century, during which the disciples of the gospel in France were pining in dungeons and in the galleys, were enduring captivity and famine, were expiring amid the flames, or dying on the field of battle. The second notable 21st of January came round in 1793. This day had, too, its procession through the streets of Paris. Again the king was the chief figure. Again there were tumult and shouting. Again was heard the cry for more victims. Again there were black scaffolds. And again the scenes of the day were closed by horrid executions. Louis XVI, struggling hand to hand with his gaolers and executioners, was dragged forward to the block, and there held down by main force till the axe had fallen, and his dissevered head rolled on the scaffold. Have we not witnessed a third dismal 21st of January in France? It was the winter of 1870-71. 4 months has Paris suffered siege. The famine is sore in the city. The food of man has disappeared from her luxurious tables. Her inhabitants ravenously devour unclean and abominable things, the vermin of the sewers, the putrid carcasses of the streets. Within the city, The inhabitants are pining away with cold, hunger, and disease. Without the sword, a victorious foe awaits them. Paris will rouse herself and break through the circle of fire and steel that hems her in. The attempt is made, but fails. Her soldiers are driven back before the victorious German, and again are cooped up within her miserable walls. On the 21st of January, 1871, it was resolved to capitulate to the conqueror. Chapter 22. Basil and the Institutes. Glory of the sufferers. Francis I again turns to the German Protestants. They shrink back. His doublings. The persecuting edicts. Departure of the Queen of Navarre from Paris. New day to burn. Calvin. Strasbourg. Calvin arrives there. Bucer Capito, etc. Calvin dislikes their narrowness. Goes on to Basil. Basil, its situation and environs, soothing effect on Calvin's mind. His interview with Erasmus. Erasmus lays the egg. Terrified at what comes of it. Draws back. Calvin's enthusiasm. Erasmus's prophecy. Catherine Klein. First sketch of the Institutes. What led Calvin to undertake the work? Its sublimity, its onerousness. We described in our last chapter the explosion that followed the publication of the Manifesto against the Mass. In one and the same night it was placarded over a great part of France, and when the morning broke, and men came forth to read it, there were consternation and anger throughout the kingdom. It proclaimed only the truth, but it was truth before its time in France. It was a bolt flung at the Mass and its believers, which might silence and crush them. But if it failed to do this, it would rouse them into fury and provoke a terrible retaliation. It did the latter. The throne and the whole kingdom had been polluted. The Holy Sacrament blasphemed. The land was in danger of being smitten with terrible woes. And so a public atonement was decreed for the public offense which had been offered. Not otherwise, it pleased the king, his prelates, and his nobles to think, could France escape the wrath of the Most High. The terrible rites of the day of expiation we have already chronicled. Was the God that France worshipped some inexorable and remorseless deity, seeing she propitiated him with human sacrifices? The tapers carried that day by the penitents, who swept in long procession through the streets of the capital, blended their lights with the lurid glare of the fires in which the Lutherans were burned, and the loud chant of the priest and choirster rose amid no cries and sobs from the victims. These noble men, who were now dragged to the burning pile, uttered no cry, they shed no tear. That were a weakness that would have stained the glory of their sacrifice. They stood with majestic mien at the stake, and looked with calmness on the tortures their enemies had prepared for them, nor did they blanch when the flames blazed up around them. The sacrifice of old, when led to the altar, was crowned with garlands. So it was with these martyrs. They came to the altar to offer up their lives crowned with the garlands of joy and praise. Their faith, their courage, their reliance on God when suffering in His cause, their vivid anticipations of future glory, were the white robes in which they dressed themselves when they ascended the altar to die. France, let us hope, will not always be ignorant of her true heroes. These have shed around her a renown purer and brighter 100 times than all the glory she has earned on the battlefield from the days of Francis to those of the last Napoleon. Hardly had Francis I concluded his penitential procession when he again turned to the Protestant princes of Germany and attempted to resume negotiations with them. They not unnaturally asked of him an explanation of his recent proceedings. Why so anxious to court the favor of the Protestants of Germany when he was burning the Protestants of France? Were there two true faiths in the world, the creed of Rome on the west of the Rhine, and the religion of Wittenberg on the east of that river? But the king was ready with his excuse, and his excuse was that of almost all persecutors of every age. The king had not been burning Lutherans, but executing traitors. If those he had put to death had imbibed Reformed sentiments, it was not for their religion, but for their sedition that they had been punished. Such was the excuse which Francis gave the German princes in his letter of the 15th of February. To stop this plague of disloyalty from spreading, he punished its originators severely, as his ancestors had also done in like cases. He even attempted to induce Melanchthon to take up his abode in Paris, where he would have received him with honor, and burned him a few months afterwards. But these untruths and doublings availed Francis little. Luther had no faith in princes, least of all had he faith in Francis I. Melanchthon, anxious as he was to promote conciliation, yet refused to enter a city on the streets of which the ashes of the fires in which the disciples of Christ had been burned were not yet cold. And the Protestant princes, though desirous of strengthening their political defenses, nevertheless shrank back from a hand which they saw was red with the blood of their brethren. The situation in France began to be materially altered. The king's disposition had undergone a change for the worse. A gloomy determination to crush heresy had taken possession of him, and was clouding his better qualities. The men of letters who had shed a luster upon his court and realm were beginning to withdraw. They were terrified by the stakes which they saw around them, not knowing but that their turn might come next. The monks were again looking up, which promised no good for the interests of learning. Not content with the executions of the terrible 21st of January, the king continued to issue edicts against the sect of Lutherans still swarming in the realm. He wrote to the provincial parliaments, exhorting them to furnish money and prisons for the extirpation of heresy. Lastly, he indicted an ordinance declaring printing abolished all over France, under pain of the gallows. That so barbarous a decree should have come from a prince who gloried in being the leader of the literary movements of his age would not have been credible had it not been narrated by historians of name. It is one among 100 proofs that literary culture is no security against the spirit of persecution. Of those who now withdrew from Paris was Margaret of Valois, the king's sister. We have seen the hopes that she longed and ardently cherished that her brother would be won to the Reformation. But now that Francis I had cast the die, and sealed his choice by the awful deeds of blood we have narrated, Margaret, abandoning all hope, quitted Paris, where even the palace could hardly protect her from the stake, and retired to her own kingdom of Bern. Her departure, and that of the exiles who had preceded her, if it was the beginning of that social and industrial decadence over which since has gone on, amid many deceitful appearances in France, was the dawn of a new day to Bern. Her court became the asylum of the persecuted. Many refugee families transported their industry and their fortunes to her provinces, and the prosperity which had taken a long adieu of France began to enrich her little kingdom. Soon a new face appeared upon the state of the Bernese. The laws were reformed, schools were opened, many branches of industry were imported and very successfully cultivated, and, in short, the foundations were now laid of that remarkable prosperity which made the little kingdom of the Pyrenees resemble an oasis amid the desert which France and Spain were now beginning to become. When Margaret went to her grave in 1549, she left a greater to succeed her in the government of the little territory which had so rapidly risen from rudeness to wealth and civilization. Her daughter, Jeanne d'Albret, is one of the most illustrious women in history. We return to Calvin, in the track of whose footsteps it is that the great movement set for the rising of one kingdom and the fall of another is to be sought. He now begins to be by very much the chief figure of his age. Francis I with his court, Charles V with his armies, are powers more imposing but less real than Calvin. They pass across the stage with a great noise, but half a century afterwards, when we come to examine the traces they had left behind them, it is with difficulty that we can discover them. Other kings and other armies are busy effacing them, and imprinting their own in their room. It is Calvin's work that endures and goes forward with the ages. We have seen him, a little before the bursting of the storm, leave Paris, never more to enter its gates. Setting out in the direction of Germany, and traveling on horseback, he arrived in due time at Strasbourg. Its name, the city of the highways, sufficiently indicates its position, and the part it was expected to play in the then system of Europe. Strongly fortified, it stood like a mailed warrior at the point where the great roads of northern Europe intersected one another. It was the capital of Alsace, which was an independent territory, thrown in, as it were, in the interests of peace between Eastern and Western Europe, and therefore its fortifications were on purpose of prodigious strength. As kings were rushing at one another, now pushing eastward from France into Germany, and now rushing across the Rhine from Germany into France, eager to give battle and redden the earth with blood, this man in armor, the city of the highways namely, who stood right in their path, compelled them to halt until their anger should somewhat subside, and peace might be maintained. A yet more friendly office did Strasbourg discharge to the persecuted children of the Reformation. Being a free city, it offered asylum to the exiles from surrounding countries. Its magistrates were liberal, its citizens intelligent, its college was already famous. The strong walls and firm gates that would have resisted the tempests of war had yielded to the gospel, and the Reformation had found entrance into Strasbourg at an early period. Bucer, Capito, and Hideo, whom we have already met with, were living there at the time of Calvin's visit, and the pleasure of seeing them and conversing with them had no small share in inducing the reformer to turn his steps in the direction of this city. In one respect he was not disappointed. He much relished the piety and the learning of these men, and they in turn were much impressed with the seriousness and greatness of character of their young visitor. But in another respect he was disappointed in them. Their views of divine truth lacked depth and comprehensiveness, and their scheme of reformation was, in the same proportion, narrow and defective. The path which they loved, a middle way between Wittenberg and Rome, was a path which Calvin did not, or would not, understand. To him there were only two faiths, a true and a false, and to him there could be but two paths, and the attempt to make a third between the two was, in his judgment, to keep open the road back to Rome. All the greater minds of the Reformation were with Calvin on this point. Those only who stood in the second class among the reformers gave way to the dream of reconciling Rome and the gospel, a circumstance which we must attribute not to the greater charity of the latter, but to their incapacity to comprehend either the system of Rome or the system of the gospel in all the amplitude that belongs to each. Calvin grew weary of hearing day after day plans propounded which, at the best, could have put patched and soldered a hopelessly rotten system, but would have accomplished no reformation, and so, after a sojourn of a few months, he took his departure from Strasbourg, and began his search for the quiet nook where he might give himself to the study of what he felt must, under the Spirit, be his great instructor, the Bible. The impression was growing upon him, and his experience at Strasbourg had deepened that impression. That it was not from others that he was to learn the divine plan. He must himself search it out in the holy oracles. He must go aside with God, like Moses on the mount, and there he would be shown the fashion of that temple which he was to build in Christendom. Following the course of the Rhine, Calvin went on to Basel. Basel is the gate of Switzerland as one comes from Germany, and being a frontier town, situated upon one of the then great highways of Europe, it enjoyed a large measure of prosperity. The Huguenot traveler, Misson, who visited it somewhat more than a century after the time of which we speak, says of it, the largest, fairest, richest city now reckoned to be in Switzerland. Its situation is pleasant, and may even in some respects be styled romantic. Its chief feature is the Rhine, even here within sight, if one may so speak, of the mountains where it was born, a broad, majestic river, sweeping past the town with rapid flow, or rather dividing it into two unequal parts, the little Basel lying on the side toward Germany, and joined to the great Basel by a long wooden bridge, now changed into one of stone. Crowning the western bank of the Rhine, in the form of a half-moon, are the buildings of the city, conspicuous among which are the fine towers of the Minster. Looking from the esplanade of the cathedral, one's eye lights on the waters of the river, on the fresh and beautiful valleys through which it rolls, on the gentle hills of the Black Forest beyond, sprinkled with dark pines, and agreeably relieved by the sunny glades on which their shadows fall, while a short walk to the south of the town brings at the tops of the Jura upon the horizon, telling the traveler that he has reached the threshold of a region of mountainous grandeur. They have a custom which has become a law, says the traveler to whom we have referred above, speaking of Basel, and which is singular and very commendable. 'Tis that whoever passes through Basel and declares himself to be poor, they give him victuals, I think for 2 or 3 days, and some other relief, if he speaks Latin. Much as the scene presents itself to the tourist of this day, it would appear to Calvin more than 3 centuries ago. There was the stream rolling in its milk-white floods into the sea. Nor was he ignorant of the fact that it had borne on its current the ashes of Huss and Jerome, to bury them grandly in the ocean. There was the long wooden bridge that spans the Rhine, with its crescent-like line of buildings drawn along the brow of the opposite bank. There were the Minster towers, beneath whose shadow Ecolampadius, already dismissed from labor, was resting in the sleep of the tomb. There were the emerald valleys, enclosing the towns with a carpet of the softest green. There were the sunny glades, and the tall dark pines on the eastern hills, and in the south were the azure tops of the Jura peering over the landscapes. A scene like this, so finely blending quietude and sublimity, must have had a soothing influence on a mind like Calvin's. It must have appeared to him the very retreat he had so long sought for, and fain would he be to turn aside for a while here and rest. Much troubled was the world around. The passions of men were raising frightful tempests in it. Armies and battles and stakes made it by no means a pleasant dwelling place. But these quiet valleys and those distant peaks spoke of peace. And so the exile, weary of foot, and yet more weary of heart, for his brethren were being led as sheep to the slaughter, very unobtrusively, but very thankfully entered within those gates to which Providence had led him, and where he was to compose a work which still keeps its place at the head of the Reformation literature, the Institutes. Be informed, edified, and grow in the faith as your spirit is daily nourished in a biblical worldview. because you love the truth. FirstAmendmentRadio.net/MOPI. Faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the Word of God. Always listenable, at work or on the go. FirstAmendmentRadio.net/MOBI. No download or app necessary.